Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Beyond the Trip. This is actually the last episode of the first season. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining me on this journey so far. After this episode number 12, I'm going to be taking a little break, recalibrating, resting a little bit, and also thinking about and beginning to record season 2. So in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by IPAT, the Indigenous Psychedelic Assisted Therapies group. They're dedicated to supporting the accessibility and therapeutic use of plant medicines for Indigenous peoples. Their vision is to create a culturally safe model of psychedelic-assisted therapy that honors Indigenous wisdom, which has guided the use of plant medicines for thousands of years. And they recognize Indigenous peoples as the global knowledge keepers in this practice. IPAT's purpose is to develop a model that incorporates Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and emphasizes the importance of healing within community. By placing cultural safety at the forefront, IPAT aims to ensure that this model is not only accessible to Indigenous peoples, but is also beneficial and accessible for all. So I'm joined by 3 members of IPAT, all of the co-founders. Gemstone, who is a First Nations woman, educator and wellness practitioner with mixed heritage from around the globe. She's passionate about integrating original knowledge into education and wellness spaces through connection and decolonized learning methods. Kurt Malley is a proud Murrugle man, an Indigenous therapist, cultural educator, and a spiritual teacher. He's also the co-founder of IPAT, and he was one of the therapists on the psilocybin-assisted therapy trial in the treatment of prolonged grief that took place recently in Queensland, Australia. Bianca is a clinical psychologist based in Brisbane, Australia, with a special interest in complex trauma and dissociative disorders, and also in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In this episode, we talk about IPAT's recently published paper, the link for which is in our show notes, the importance of inclusion of Indigenous voices in this emerging space from the very beginning, with the importance of cultural safety in psychedelic therapy for Indigenous people, and the challenges with the medical model of distress for Indigenous folk, but also for everyone in the population. Something that I've spoken about a number of times on this podcast. And we also talk about the importance of collaboration and in bringing together different perspectives in this field, which was one of the reasons I wanted to begin to do this podcast in the first place. We're going to be coming from different worlds in many ways, but how can we bring that together to really create a healthy ecosystem in the psychedelic-assisted therapy space? So, I hope you enjoy this episode. Let's get into it. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on this evening to talk to me and on Beyond the Trip podcast. It's been a little while in the making, and I've heard about your work at IPAT for such a long time. So it feels really wonderful to have you all here and to hear about your journey up until this point. I'm really looking forward to kind of diving into how you came to be in this work, how you came to work together, and what your hopes are for IPAT moving forward. And so maybe we'll start there with some kind of, I'd love to hear how you all got into this work and how you came to be working together and to develop IPAT. There's probably a lot to that. So, take it wherever you like, really. It's up to you.
Amazing. I might start then. My name's Jem and I'm joining from Wurundjeri lands. So I'm really grateful to be here in Naarm, which is Melbourne, northern suburbs of Melbourne. Initially, Bianca reached out to me, which was nearly 3 years ago now. It just has been so fast. And she just introduced herself, told me that she was quite involved in the newly emerging field of psychedelic assisted therapies as it was just legislated within Australia. And just asked me if I was aware that there was no Indigenous voice in that space. And if I had any interest in connecting with her and learning a little bit more. So we had a great conversation, and yeah, certainly I recognize that it was so important, as especially a field that has quite a huge promise for mental health treatment and, holistic well-being within Australia. There's certainly needed to be Indigenous representation, especially considering that plant medicines are grounded in Indigenous knowledge. So
Mm.
as a cultural person, it's so important to be responsive to anything that's happening on cultural lands,
Mm.
especially if it can cause harm too. So we wanted to really make sure that there was somebody talking about cultural inclusivity. And then I actually reached out to Kurt, who I'd worked alongside for probably 4 or 5 years previous to that. And we had a yarn about that, and he was keen to get on board as well, as at that point we had Scarlett, another First Nations therapist who came and joined us initially, who now she's stepped back from IPAT to really focus on her artwork. But initially that's how it happened. And yeah, so it started.
Mhm. And at the time, I was working in an Aboriginal health service and also in private practice, and I was having clients ask me, wanting to know about the trials that were going on and how they were interested in participating and wanting to be able to access these treatments. But was there going to be provisions around cultural safety? Was there going to be Indigenous therapists involved, or was it going to be safe for them to participate? So yeah, in real time, just starting to get quite concerned about the fact that, we know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have some of the poorest health outcomes in this country, and, astronomical rates of, suicide in communities, yet they may not be able to access this treatment if it's not safe to do so. So yeah, I started to reach out to Jem, and, that was that. And here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an important piece to be doing, isn't it? And so, Kurt, do you want to share a bit about it sounds like Jem got in touch with you, and tell us a bit about that.
When Jem reached out, I'm always excited to collaborate with anything that Jem does, but this was kind of right up my alley, and yeah, just very intrigued to see what was actually happening within the clinical settings. And from that point, obviously we're able to get our foot into the space, which, is a whole story, not, altogether. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I was reading the paper that you recently had published, and one of the things that really struck me, in there was lots of things, but that this is, we're really at the beginning of this emerging field in Australia, and we've done this kind of strange leapfrog from, it felt like the research was really just beginning, and then now we're using clinical practice, but we're still at the beginning, and this is a real opportunity to try to develop something different that involves collaboration between Indigenous knowledge and the Western paradigm. And that was very striking to me, because I think there's some real power in that phrase and those thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that every area of the healthcare system needs decolonising, it needs more cultural responsiveness. But I think the reason that we thought it was so important for us to have a presence here in this space, because it is such a newly emerging field. So if there's Indigenous presence and perspectives and inclusion from the get-go, especially as guidelines and legislation is happening, then it's just another area of medicine, or this area of science that doesn't need, to have that as an afterthought. So it was really important that we were right from the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I really agree. And it's recently, the paper that you've recently published has been, do you want to share a little bit about that and how that came to be? Because there's some really interesting ideas, and I'll definitely put the link to that in the show notes for people to read if they haven't come across it. It feels like it was something that'd be really important to speak about.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So this came about, Kurt and I worked on a clinical trial together, psilocybin trial in Brisbane, and chief investigator said, why don't you write a paper about everything you're doing, in IPAT? And, one of the reasons she advocated for more funding to be able to employ an Indigenous therapist in our trial as well. And so it's really a bit of a call to action to have that Indigenous involvement from the get-go and looking at, what we've seen worldwide in the psychedelic space, that this is not just a Australian concern, that there's concerns globally about the cultural appropriation, the endangerment and exploitation and extractive use of these medicines, and I guess uninitiated clinician entering into these transpersonal spaces without knowing how to navigate this territory and hold that safe and sacred space, because I think there is a bit of a myth that in the clinical setting that these things don't matter, but they absolutely do. And the people that have the knowledge and the wisdom and the skills to navigate these spaces are Indigenous peoples. They've been, working with plant kin since time immemorial and navigating these transpersonal spaces. And so the paper's really a call to action in that regard, and how we can merge, the Western science with Indigenous wisdom to create a model that is rooted in these ways of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, that is an alternative model for all people to benefit from.
Yeah, that's something that I also think is also really important to say, is that the Western medical model has a lot of problems for lots of different people. And I think that bringing in Indigenous ways of being and thinking and doing is going to be useful kind of for all people. I mean, my background, I've spoken about this a few times on this podcast. I won't go into the full story about it now, but, comes from working and training with someone called Lucy Johnson, who created an alternative to the medical model for diagnosis called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And I don't know if anyone's heard of that, but she was my teacher. And so I guess when I was reading your paper, I was like, this is going to be so, I really resonated with a lot of things you were saying about the importance of bringing in Indigenous ways of knowing. And also, we need something different. We need something different for these medicines. I understand how we've got to where we are in terms of using the Western framework, and we kind of had to start there maybe I don't know. But I don't think it's going to be the best way to work with these medicines going forward. I have lots of things to say about that, but yeah.
We talk a lot about the issue of accessibility, because in order to access these medicines, you have to have a specific diagnosis under that Western paradigm of treatment-resistant depression or treatment-resistant PTSD, whereas, for some Indigenous peoples, those words are, they're not going to resonate with that, or how we diagnose these things is going to be very different in a white middle-class society.
There's certainly barriers to people even receiving a diagnosis from First Nations communities. They may not already engage with mental health treatment in the way that others would through a Western framework, especially when there are cultural practices available that people consider as preference to use for well-being. So I think even to have a diagnosis to fit into what these trials or even treatments are asking of people, there'll be certainly limitations and lack of accessibility for First Nations communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really important thing, because the way that people get into trials in the first place is really quite a long, complex process. But there's just so many additional barriers if the dominant medical model doesn't feel like it fits with your culture, but also if potentially stepping into that maybe has felt unsafe in the past as well. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the exact reason why I was fired in the first place to work up in the institute, is because there was some mob that went through the screening process and got to a certain point where they actually pulled out because they felt culturally unsafe. And which they had every reason to, because they knew that there was no Indigenous representation, no kind of acknowledgement of the space that they were doing the kind of work. And a lot of alarm bells started to go off, coming from a cultural perspective. Who is holding the space and how are they holding the space is a very important aspect, which, it's being held to a certain degree, but not holistically, or looking at the sacredness of all of doing this work.
Mm-hmm. 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 And can I ask a bit more on that, Kurt? So what were some of the things that you were able to bring in your role on the trial that that you felt were really important for Indigenous folk coming into that trial, but also for all people?
Well, working in this space, it goes beyond psychology. We are working, as Bianca mentioned, in the transpersonal realms, beyond the psyche into the spiritual realms, which there's all types of things that happen in those realms, which, it's hard for the analytical mind to even comprehend. But this is where these compounds and different plant teachers and medicines take us to a place that goes beyond our own logic. And this is where the magic happens, where the healing starts to take forward, because we go beyond all of the patterns, the programming, all of the things that have created any kind of disorder, dysfunction, disease. So I did go on a bit of a tangent there, but as I do, coming back to, how we use these for a very long time in different traditions. And it's actually a ceremonial thing that we're doing here. And to totally disregard, something as simple as giving thanks, and before administering the tablet or actually inducing, having the whatever medicinal compound. So that's something that I feel I'm bringing into the space. I'm not taking anything away from the current protocols and everything else that has gone through a vigorous process, but just adding that moment of pause to give thanks, because this is what we did in ceremony. It was all about gratitude and appreciation, and that constant giving thanks through the process of whatever we're working towards.
One of the things that we talk about is to be able to even think about every single time, funding grants go in, that, cultural considerations need to be made, that there needs to be money there to provide culturally safe care. Now, whether that's through collaborations with IPAT, where Kurt or myself could go into somebody else's trial to sit with a First Nations participant, or whether they start advocating for and recruiting their own Indigenous therapists for these trials, because that in itself, for the fact that, all of these trials are happening in a state where there's people that are really in need of it, but they just cannot engage through lack of safety.
And even before that, one thing that we also had in the trial Kurt and I worked on is Kurt did connect with some of the local traditional owners beforehand to let them know what we were doing. And we did have a welcome and a smoking ceremony for the space that we were conducting the trial. And so even before sitting with the participant, that relationship building and that, creation of a safe and clean space for this work to happen was all part of the process as well. And not just for working with the Indigenous participant, but for all participants of the trial, So grateful to our chief investigator that, supported that.
Yeah, that sounds
It
really.
also goes hand in hand with, cultural safety training. If there was this across the board for all trials, for all therapists, then these are some of the ways that they'd be thinking, because, to have that form of education where it's not just an afterthought, where it is foundational in the work that they're doing, some of these practices would be able to happen in any trial.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe for the listeners, I think it would be good just to say a bit about the trial that you, Kurt and Bianca, worked on, because I'm mindful that people might not know about it. So people listening outside of Australia or people who haven't heard about the work that you're doing, maybe we'll just give a little background for that. Whoever wants to.
Yeah, so we did a trial earlier this year, Australia, and it was last year.
Yeah.
Get
And
on
it's still,
dates, but
still tricky, isn't it?
yes, so we did have a trial as mid 2024 with the first Indigenous participant on the trial for prolonged grief, and it was absolute success. As we know, the medicine works, but once again, it's not what we're doing, it's how we do it. And knowing that we did create that, not only a safe but sacred space for that woman to come in and be able to feel like she was held, because the participant that we did have, knowing that, a very powerful woman, she's used to holding her own community and holding a lot of space for everyone. It was good for her to be in that setting where she was able to let go. And if you're not in a safe or sacred space, then you're not going to really be able to access what the intention of what the medicine does, and reach those parts of where the work really takes place.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds. And what I'm hearing in what all of you, I think, have said, and there's a lot that there's a lot to what we've been talking about. But what I'm hearing is that really, if we're wanting to think about kind of collaborating and bringing together Indigenous wisdom and into this process, it has to start at the beginning, right? When you're writing a proposal, you're looking for funding for bringing some training, some collaboration, and maybe in how you write even the protocols. Because I've been involved in a few research trials, and I think that there's a lot that happens before anyone's sitting in the room that there's really that IPAT could be involved in, and there are so many trials happening at the moment. And so definitely also want to cover off on like how people can kind of get involved and when they should be thinking about doing that if they're interested, because I think there is a lot of interest out there in my experience, but I don't know if that's what do you think? Like, if there's someone listening to this podcast now who's just about kind of thinking about getting a trial off the ground, what would be the first step for them in getting in touch with you or working with you?
Well, definitely, as I mentioned before, is center this kind of cultural safety training, as foundational within their teams. Have budgets for Indigenous facilitators to be able to come in, the therapists to be able to sit with First Nations clients. That would be at least something that, could be a really great start. So that way it could be advertised that there is cultural responsiveness. I think it's great that Kurt and I can come in for these things, but I think it is a responsibility of all therapists. And APRA even is talking about this now, about our therapists upgrading their cultural competencies. So I think that should be the bare minimum that all therapists are doing to provide this, that cultural responsiveness across the board. Also considering, I think we need to remember that a lot of these settings, clinics and hospitals have been historically harmful for First Nations people. It's only been in very, very recent times, like the last 50 years or under, in some cases, that First Nations people were even able to enter those spaces. So they're not conducive with a healing environment for a lot of First Nations peoples and communities. So, when there is that cultural responsiveness, we can consider other environments, at least for preparation, at least for those conversations, and putting people more at ease that are going to go into a space that they find quite triggering, for themselves or intergenerationally as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And, at the moment, most trials are happening either in the university settings or in a hospital or in a clinic space. And you're right. I think there's a lot to be gained for all people in widening that, I think. I think that would be great in terms of kind of being in maybe a more natural environment or a place where there's more nature. I remember being involved in, because of the Monash trial that I worked on, we did a self-experience, and it was definitely quite jarring to finish my psilocybin dosing. And then I was, picked up by a beautiful friend who was my support person, but going home through the traffic is not an ideal place to be integrating, I think. And I think we knew that, and that's what we had to work with. And we were very lucky in some ways to have the room that we did that was not too clinical, but it's still a university. That still would be good to have it out in the community, I think.
I think the other issue is, from that Indigenous to a Western viewpoint is, individualistic healing that happens within this space. Whereas for First Nations people, it's more relational. So, the strength of a person is also aligned with, their connection within community, their roles and responsibilities. So there's no real space in the current models that we're seeing for, those Indigenous values or those ways of knowing, being and doing, where they are part of that community, and community-based healing is foundational in their overall well-being.
Yeah. And what would you like to see done differently in that space, Jem? Because I think that's a really important point. If you could create, and if you do create something in the future, what would it look like?
Well, IPAT has created something.
Tell us.
We're in the process, and for anyone that's listening, we would love help in being funded to complete our vision, is to create a point of difference, not just for First Nations people, but for all people to be able to have choice within this field. Certainly, group sessions as well as long-term, integration, preparation, but also group dosing sessions would be within our model. It'd be in a, nature-based model as well, and just really more aligned with these, what's foundational in the Indigenous knowledge systems. And also considering, the original ways that these medicines were actually in relationship with humans. And that was in these ways, in ceremony, not in such a clinical medical model. So really just honouring the spirit of these medicines, of country as well as community.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they've been used by Indigenous communities all across the world for millennia, not in a hospital, not for a specific diagnosis. I mean, so I would personally love to see us move away from it needing to be only used for a specific diagnostic label, because that has so many challenges and problems for all sorts of communities. And so that's one of my hopes for the future as well.
And also not reflective of positive outcomes. So, I think of someone close to me that participated in a trial here, and did it improve their life for the diagnosis that they have? Will improve the diagnosis they have? Absolutely not. But did it improve their overall quality of life and well-being? Absolutely. But that's not going to be captured in as being, successful from what's being measured as such as well. So I think there's, we miss out on a lot when we are trying to put these things in a box like that as well. But, the other thing that's kind of integral to our model is giving these things the time and space that they need in those Indigenous ways, and being in sync with the cycles of nature. And things happen slowly and cautiously and intentionally. So, that's something that I think we'd like to see as well, is this process getting the space that it deserves.
Yeah. I think, if I think about my own experience, like if I could just talk to the self-experience that I had, it took me at this part of the trial. It was 3 years ago now, and I'm still integrating it. I still stay close to that experience. I'm still unfolding parts of it in my everyday life. And so that's the other side of it. There's the preparation can take a long time, but the integration shouldn't ever finish at the end of, even if you are on that pathway. It can take years, and should be honored in that way.
There isn't a lot of design in these trials that allows for that soft place to land in that ongoing connection to people who have had a similar journey or a similar experience, and maintaining connection to a community, because so many people that participate in these trials, they don't know other people that have worked with plant medicines. Everyone thinks that they just went and tripped on mushrooms, or that, their experience that they had was really woo-woo and now they've lost it a little bit. And so part of our model is also about creating community and creating a safe place to land on the other side of this that is an ongoing source of connection to people, because I definitely see.
And even lifelong integration, some of these methods and practices that we have interwoven within our model is lifelong integration. It's not about just sitting with the therapist long term, which obviously that will happen, but it's finding ways where people start to build their relationships themselves with the natural world, and which will give them not only, their more than human kin community, but lifetime of support as well, once they really have embraced these ways that, unfortunately, so many people are so disconnected from, and they're so dependent on that therapist relationship. Whereas through an Indigenous knowledge system, we know that our lead facilitator is the land, that we always have that support from the earth, from country. But so to be able to pass on some of those ways within our model, we feel will be beneficial for everyone, not just First Nations participants.
Yeah, that's so beautiful what you just said, Jem, about the lead facilitator being the land. And I think that is something that's so important to remember and can get easily forgotten or not mentioned in, and I think in trial spaces, that I've been involved in, there's an attempt at different therapists might do it differently. There's an attempt at some sort of ceremony, if you like, but there's definitely something deeper that I think it would be good to think about. And I know that from talking to other people, something that I hear quite a lot from non-Indigenous therapists who want to have, how do they have reverence for Indigenous culture without falling into cultural appropriation? And that's something that we've kind of touched on a little bit, but it's something that I hear a lot. So I thought I'd put that to you and see what your thoughts were on that.
Well, they engage with Indigenous facilitators. They want to bring Indigenous content, or they do some cultural training. It's one thing to want that, but you've actually got to commit to becoming culturally responsive. Otherwise they begin to start looking at their own lineages and reconnect there. And that's the way some of these practices are designed, that we can work with Indigenous, non-Indigenous people and help support nurturing their ancestral wisdom that can come through. So that can be for therapists as well.
Yeah. So, that's an important point, isn't it? To kind of connecting to their own lineage. I think that's I was talking to another guest on the podcast about that, and in she's kind of relearning how to connect into her Jewish heritage on a deeper level. And, I think that's something that people can do for themselves. And even if you might not know exactly where that comes from for you, it's in you, right? Like it's kind of in your soul somewhere. It on some part of you knows that.
I know Kurt was going to share something.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You did touch on exactly how we do encourage everyone to get in contact or connect with their own lineage, with their own culture. And for some people, it is difficult to access that, and they may not have the knowledge of their bloodline or their lineage. But regardless, as you said, Asaway, there's this innate, on a cellular level, there's memory there that when we do start to delve into certain cultures and traditions, we do see the blueprint there of how we do connect back to the sacred. And whether it was through ceremony, ritual, song, or dance, there's a very profound blueprint there that shows us that we all had it in our own way. It's just different styles and times and languages, but there is a similar language that goes beyond what we can really see and hear. We can feel it. We know it. It's innate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say that people can't, therapists, it's, any ceremony or anything is about honoring the sacred. It's holding something really safely with an honoring. And so, if people aren't able to connect with their own lineages initially, as Kurt said, we do have practices that help to activate that cellular memory. But initially, it's about walking into the space, being accountable for how they're showing up with their energy. It may just be as simple as, setting an intention, grounding themselves before they come in, really sitting with their own energy and being accountable for that energy exchange with their client. So any ritual building, anything that they're doing with purpose and intention can become the sacred. It doesn't have to be grounded in a cultural practice. So, if they're making their personal rituals and obviously with consent with their client they're working with and creating space for their client to bring in for what's comfortable for them, then they're creating that sacred space. But again, it's about, being that accountable for how they're showing up in that space, that understanding that they are working with spirit. They're working at an energetic level. It's not just a physical, client and therapist sitting in a room. There's so much more going on in that space. And again, this is things that we're advocating for, knowing that people are having a spiritual experience. It might be called mental health treatment or trial, but it's just really, bringing to the forefront that these medicines have, since time immemorial have been used for so much, or they've never been used for mental health. It's been for holistic well-being, always in spiritual experiences. And I think that's what's, mostly left out of the conversation here in Australia.
Yeah, that's such a important point and it resonates a lot with me. And I think, it sounds like for you, the way that it's being brought in Australia, there's this idea that you need to be a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist to do this work, or, more and more psychotherapists also involved. But I feel like, yes, I use my clinical psychology training all the time, but I don't think that equipped me to do this work well. And I think, I think about the kind of spiritual experiences that people are having, and you do need to have some holding around that as well. It's incredibly important. Bianca?
Well, I think that, the element of therapist training is a huge issue as well, because part of me thinks like, all right, these medicines have been utilized since time immemorial by Indigenous peoples worldwide, and people undergo very long apprenticeships and mentorships before they're allowed to serve these medicines. I've spent many years living in Mexico and, with the peyote tradition in America, my apprentices for nearly 10 years before they even serve peyote for the first time, right? And then it's like, and yet we here in the Western world are thinking that could be possible for therapists that have never sat with the medicine to be serving and holding space. I mean, part of me thinks that's really arrogant to think that we can bypass any kind of apprenticeship or experience. Now, I know we're not doing this work here in a clinical setting. We're not picking up, Shipibo tradition in the Amazon and plonking it in the Western context. But in terms of how we train and how we learn how to hold that space, it is through that experiential learning. And a lot of people say, but certain therapeutic modalities don't require you to undergo your own treatment when you learn them. So why should this be any different? The reality is every modality I've trained in that has been robust and useful has required me to undergo my own treatment as part of the training. Sensory motor psychotherapy required me to see a sensory motor psychotherapist. EMDR required me to have my own EMDR. So why should something that has the psychospiritual connotations of, that plant medicine does be any different? And I know that's a very contentious issue in the community.
Yeah.
But I just think if people in the jungle and are apprenticing for X number of years, then why do we think that we can just jump in and start serving with no experience?
Yeah. And I think, having the self experience that I was able to have before I started working as a therapist on the trial I worked on was a contentious issue. They managed to do that because it was a separate research trial, and so that's how they were able to offer that. But in general, if it's outside of a research trial, that's actually not possible within the legal frameworks within Australia at the moment, and I find that really concerning. I mean, when I did my clinical psych training in England, I had to have my own therapy a lot of the way through that. I don't think that's always the case, but that was for my training. And I think, you really do have to be willing to step into the shoes of your clients and receive the training in I personally think you should do that in any therapeutic modality that you use. I really strongly feel that. And I think that's true of psychedelics. And I mean, I know there's probably caveats to that. People may have I wouldn't want to exclude someone who had a physical reason why they couldn't take a psychedelic, for example, from doing this work if they had other things that meant they really wanted, that they would be a really good person to do this work. But yeah, I think it's something that is really important to think about as we move into the clinical use here, because at the moment it's actually really quite challenging for people to have those experiences in a legal framework in Australia outside of a trial. So that's a can of worms, but an important one. So, I mean, I guess it was something that we've probably covered a little bit, but I'd like to give some more space to really is what opportunities do you really want to see for Indigenous and non-Indigenous folk to work together? What's already happening and what do you think is needed? And we've spoke about some of this, but I feel like there's a bit more to.
As far as working together, from an IPAT perspective, we've put our hand out for over 2.5 years as a hand of welcome for people to engage with us through cultural consultancy for their trials, treatments, or practice. And, we love connecting with people. So there's always space for collaboration, as I mentioned, to be involved as Indigenous therapists in other people's trials or practice. But we do advocate for recruitment of more Indigenous therapists. So Kurt and myself became the first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people trained within Australia that were non-clinical. We advocated for nearly 2 years for us to be trained. Neither of us had Western registration with a pig body. So, this is one of the things that we're really proud of, that we've created that legacy for Indigenous therapists that are coming after us, because we may not have Western qualifications, but both of us have quite extensive qualifications in trauma-informed care and practice from an Indigenous perspective. So, for cultural people, we are seen as therapists. So I think, as I said, to create that legacy so more people can follow in our footsteps. And if the industry is really serious about, as they say, that they want to make this space more inclusive, then they need to be able to start recruiting Indigenous therapists. Or, as we said, we've provided opportunities through training where they can continue to engage with us and build their cultural responsiveness. But dare I say, we've spent 2.5 years in that space. Now we're at the point where we're really excited this year about putting focus on our own model. We would love support from the industry to be able to do that, whether that's with funds, whether that's with helping with grant writing and things like that. If people are able to, start thinking in reciprocity, ways to be able to give back to an independent First Nations organisation. We've sort of worked on love, for the last 2.5 years. So, to be able to be supported by people that can help us with our own vision moving forward, I think would provide incredible help that we just aren't able to source ourselves or just have the time with the work that we're already doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll make sure that anyone who's listening to that has your contact details in the show notes. I'll put your website there, as that's probably the best thing, isn't it, for people to find you?
Absolutely.
And I can put your emails as well if you like, but we'll make sure your contact details are available, because I think there's, I think that sounds like a really important thing to be able to develop, and we need funding, and we need people to help come together and actually collaborate with you and IPAT.
Because I think I guess the irony is when we're involved on grant applications for other people's trials, it helps to make their trial look better, more culturally inclusive, which is great, and we have advocated for that. But if we're constantly engaged, that way, we're not able to honor the space that we really need to get our model off the ground. And I think moving forward, that's where we're quite passionate about being able to focus on that this year and truly give all Australians a choice within this field, not just, providing more culturally safe care and practice for Indigenous people, but giving that choice for all people that want to engage in these trials and treatments.
Yeah.
And to really see this cultural responsiveness training as core training in this space, not something that you do if you get additional funding or if you get time or those kinds of things, because, we know what the health outcomes are like for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. We know that most organisations and institutions have some requirements around closing the gap or reconciliation plans and those kinds of things. And people, express interest. And so we'd, I guess, love to see people walk the talk now and include this work as a core part of the process rather than an additional add-on as well. So that's where people can collaborate with IPAT to, for consultancy or in their trainings that are offering, to link in and connect with us in those spaces as well, because there's plenty of people that are wanting to access this medicine, as Jem has said, but it's currently not being delivered in a way that's safe for them to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting time to be alive. And, for eons, there's been a battle between science and spirituality. And we're at the time where it is coming together. And from a big picture perspective, it's where science and spirituality is acknowledging each other. And the fact that Jem and myself were able to be trained up in this and acknowledged for the work that we do within our communities is a sign that, it's coming together. And this is collaborating not with only Indigenous different working groups and clients and facilitators, but everyone coming together and using the best of what we have to help this become a sustainable process that we can all use. Doesn't matter what your background is, but it's going to create the longevity of this space without things becoming dangerous or unsafe from every aspect.
Yeah. I think it's also what I'd like to suggest or invite everyone listening to or anyone within the field is to actually read our paper. It's all laid out there of the reasons why that we're advocating in this space. Surprisingly enough, I mean, we're really, really proud of this paper, and it took a lot to get it published. We spoke about things that aren't often like to be heard in those spaces. But we've been quite surprised of the silence we've heard from the industry. We haven't had many people reach out to us to even discuss further our paper. So we wonder if it's being just overlooked, if it's being ignored, or if it's intentionally bypassed in this space for lack of accountability. So I would just like to invite everyone that is working within the PAT space to really have a read of that. Because, as I said, we've got our hand outstretched to, to really sort of walk side by side as we've always suggested, and training can be provided. We can provide private trainings for your whole team and really tailor things to the way that you're working. So we just really hope people that will embrace that work in our paper, but also in the work that we do with the intention that we offer it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jem. I think, and I'll make sure I put the link to the paper in the show notes as well, so people can find it easily. And I think it's just such a important point. And when I was reading the paper, you spoke about the alternative model have any basis in that like social and emotional well-being approach that just felt like something that would be useful for everyone. I mean, it's talk about like there's 7 interconnected domains of mind and emotion, body, family, community, culture, country, and spirituality. And I was reading that thinking, yeah, wow, this is actually something that would be useful for all humans.
Absolutely. And surprisingly, that's over 10 years old, that framework that's been available. But surprisingly, most times that we talk about this framework, many Western therapists haven't even heard of it and certainly not working with it. And you're right, Esme, it is something not just for Indigenous people, it is something that, we think is integral for holistic well-being for all people. And some of those domains that you just read out primarily are overlooked. So, to be able to really bring in methods that can help nurture those domains for all people will bring incredible outcomes and something really unique.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent about the power meaning framework, because I've been on a few tangents about this podcast already, but I think, if anyone hasn't read that, the Lucy Johnson wrote that as an alternative to the medical model of psychiatric diagnosis in the UK, because the British Psychological Society and a whole bunch of other people came out to say that this model wasn't serving people, wasn't actually serving not the community of mental health people who or humans in distress that we were trying to serve. And so we needed something a lot more holistic. And yeah, I find whenever she comes over to do training in Australia, she finds herself in a training room full of social workers, but not so many psychologists. So any psychologists listening, you haven't read that, have a look. It's free. And I will put the link in the show notes.
I think one of the final things that I'd love to just say is that, I think what is also largely overlooked is Indigenous wisdom is science. Something that has been observed over thousands and thousands of years on this continent, but certainly by Indigenous people around the world. What we're talking is not just something, sort of woo-woo. It is science that's been observed and understood, especially with these medicines, which are found, the foundation of them are through Indigenous knowledge. So I think it is really reflective of dominant systems and, systemic racism that can appear in those spaces to not even acknowledge where they're coming from. So as Kurt mentioned before, it's really about these acknowledgements, to become in right relationship with the work that people are doing, I think is at the forefront of what IPAT stands for, with our values of, everything with Indigenous knowledge is relational. So really asking people to reflect, or therapists to reflect on, what is their purpose in that space and what is their relationship to the work that they're doing and their clients. And so I guess that is something that I'd love people to begin to reflect on.
Thank you, Jem. Yeah, I think that it's really important. And I think, Kurt, did you want to add anything to that?
It works hand in hand. Like it's, the division between the polarities of what people think it is. It's actually, coming back to the non-duality of reality. And it's the coming together of all things, of all sides of different perspectives. And this is what's going to really amplify this space. And we're really going to see the evolution and growth happen, and it's going to work from having those broader perspectives and looking at from other ways.
Yeah. Collaboration,
And
right?
all Indigenous cultures from around the world have prophesized about these times too. So I agree with Kurt. We're at a really incredible time where, if we come with that humility, we can look at ways that we really can begin to weave our knowledge systems together and walk forward for the benefit of all, rather than this hierarchy of, what's getting put on top of something else. So I think, if people are willing to embrace this opportunity, I think we can look at some really positive outcomes into the future in this area.
Yeah. I think I really hope for that too. And I think, bringing this idea that science is only the thing that we call empirical science in the West is actually very unscientific if you really go through what the definition of science is. And so I really resonated with a lot of what you just said about that this is Indigenous wisdom that has been observed for millennia. And so, of course, we need to hold that. And I really hope that one of the reasons I wanted to start working in this space is I actually feel there's a real opportunity to bring some of the ideas that I was speaking about, kind of moving away from the medical model and having a much more holistic understanding, as long as we do it right and collaborate and work together with Indigenous cultures, and also, that we work together as a community. That's one of the reasons for doing the podcast. It's not something that I had any funding for, or I just wanted to do it. And I wanted to interview interesting people that I knew that were working in this space, because there was all these fascinating projects happening, and I wanted to kind of give them a space to talk about it.
When you want something bad enough, you find a way, right? And that's what we like to say about, people that continually question how they can engage with people culturally. If you do want something enough, you will find a way. So please reach out to us, and look forward to working and connecting with people into the future.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Is there anybody, Bianca or Kurt or Jem, do you have any more final comments before we wrap up for today?
I think that's it, May.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks,
Been
everybody.
great to have a yarn with you.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like there's so many things that we could keep exploring in this field. It's been really lovely to have you all here, and thank you so much for taking time out of your evenings and making this happen. It's not a small thing to get all of us in the one space together, and I really appreciate it, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I will be putting links to all those things in the show notes.
And May, thank you for really elevating our voices. I think this is, very telling and so important, why we need allyship in this space to really help get our voice and our message out there. So really appreciate you having us on.
Well, thank you.